Hello, I'm Daisy. 2 weeks ago, my father stood up in front of 30 people, friends, cousins, neighbors, and called my business a pajama hobby. He smirked. My mother laughed. Everyone else did too. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just stood up and walked out. Now here's the question I keep asking myself. What do you do when your own family doesn't want to understand you? They just want to stage you. And why did my father show up at my door 2 weeks later, holding cookies like nothing happened? What exactly was he trying to fix or control? And how did it all unravel from there? I hadn't been back to Boulder in almost a year. Spring had just started to stretch its legs, painting the trees outside my childhood home with the faintest hints of green. I stood in front of the house for a minute longer than I should have, watching the windows flicker with movement, listening to the echoes of laughter that filtered through the thick walls. It was Marla's birthday, my mother, and for the first time in months, she wanted the whole family together. Her words, not mine. I knew exactly what together meant in our family: performative warmth, plastic smiles, and enough unspoken tension to fill the Rocky Mountains behind us. I adjusted the foil over the homemade lemon tart I'd brought. Stupid, really, to think anyone would notice the zest I'd grated by hand or the effort I'd put into the crust. But I needed something in my hands, something to feel useful. Inside, the air was thick with cooking oil, cologne, and history. Dorian had arrived early, as always, already halfway through a beer, gesturing wildly while retelling some office anecdote. Callista was draped across the love seat like she owned it, her curated smile never wavering as she greeted people like a first lady at a fundraiser. Grant, my father, held court in the center, already halfway to tipsy, laughing too loud at his own punchlines. Marla saw me and offered a hug that was more pose than embrace. "Daisy," she said, "you look good. Thin. Are you eating?" I forced a smile. "Nice to see you too, Mom." The tart was placed among a row of store-bought cakes and desserts from the local upscale market. No one commented. No one asked about the recipe. We moved to the dining room. It looked the same as always. Heavy chairs, polished oak, too many forks. I took my usual place near the end, across from an uncle who barely remembered my name and next to a cousin I hadn't seen since college. Callista and Dorian sat in their usual power spots, close to Grant, within earshot of praise and attention. Dinner began with overlapping conversations, gossip about other families, job promotions, someone's trip to Italy. I stayed quiet. It wasn't that I had nothing to say. I just knew the moment I did, it'd be twisted into a joke, or worse, silence. Then Grant stood. "Now," he said, tapping his glass. "Before we get to dessert and Daisy's delightful little contribution," he smirked, glancing toward my tart, "I want to acknowledge my favorite daughter." He turned toward Callista and made a dramatic bow. Everyone laughed. "She just got promoted. Again. Vice President of Strategy. Fancy title, huh?" Callista waved her hand like it embarrassed her, but I could see the pleasure beneath. "And Dorian," Grant continued, "closed the biggest deal of his career last month. My boy's making 6 figures and still has time to mow the lawn for his mother." More laughter. Then he looked at me. That slow smile crept across his face, the one that signaled danger, not affection. "And Daisy," he said, voice dipping into mock sincerity. "Well, she's got her little project, don't you?" He turned to the guests. "She works from home, mostly in pajamas, I hear, saving the world one email at a time. Must be nice, huh?" Laughter. Actual belly laughs from people I'd once babysat or helped through math homework. I didn't laugh. I didn't even smile. My face stayed neutral, my hands still. But inside, something shattered. Marla chuckled behind her napkin. "Oh, Grant. She's always been our sensitive one." I excused myself a few minutes later, quietly collecting my coat, grabbing my purse, and walking out the front door. No one followed. No one stopped me. The drive back to my rental was silent. The kind of silence that isn't lonely, but loud with thought. That night, Marla texted, Don't be too sensitive, honey. You know your father. He didn't mean it. Love you. I stared at the screen, the words blurring under the weight of everything she didn't say. I didn't reply, because I knew exactly what she meant. I always had to be the one who understood, who forgave, who let it slide. I was the duct tape daughter, the one who patched things up, absorbed the jokes, smoothed the wrinkles. Not anymore. Sitting on the edge of my bed, still in the same clothes, I thought about every moment like this, every backhanded compliment, every time my ideas were brushed aside at family dinners, every time Grant had turned me into a punchline to boost his own ego, and every time Marla let it happen with a smile and a shrug. I wasn't confused, I wasn't sad, I was done. The decision didn't arrive in a flash, it came like a tide, quiet, steady, undeniable. No more showing up for these performances. No more hoping to be seen or understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. The next day, I deleted the family group chat from my phone. 2 days later, I unsubscribed from the family calendar invites. By the end of the week, I knew what I had to do. I didn't slam the door behind me, but that silence must have sounded louder than a scream. When I woke up the next morning, my phone buzzed with a dozen notifications. I didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, I stood by the kitchen window, fingers curled around a mug of coffee that had gone cold without a sip. The silence in my apartment was different than the kind that had blanketed the dinner table the night before. This one felt earned, intentional. Eventually, curiosity won. I unlocked my phone and instinctively opened the app I shouldn't have. The family photo was the first thing that appeared on my feed. Callista had posted it. They were all there, standing in front of Marla's ornate fireplace, smiling like they'd just solved world hunger. Dorian stood next to Marla, who wore her pearl necklace and that lavender sweater she reserved for guests. Grant was front and center, his arm around Callista, beaming like a politician mid-campaign. Even cousin Jared made it in. He hadn't been to a family event in 5 years. The caption read, "Grateful for family. Couldn't ask for more." I looked again. No one had tagged me, not one person. It wasn't an oversight. It was surgical. I stared at the photo longer than I meant to. There was a hollow spot on the edge of the group where I should have been, where I used to stand every year. Not once had I missed one of Marla's birthdays, not until now, and somehow my absence didn't just go unmentioned, it was erased. I tapped through a few more pictures, Dorian making a toast, Callista pretending to blow out candles with Marla, even a short video where Grant offered another one of his long-winded jokes. The comments below the post were glowing. "What a beautiful family. So full of love. You're lucky to have each other." I scrolled, numb, then paused. A name caught my eye. Linda Brewer. She used to be my 8th grade math teacher. She commented, "Where's Daisy these days? Haven't seen her in a while." Callista replied 3 minutes later, "She's doing her thing, off somewhere being creative, I guess. We're proud of her in our own way." In our own way. I didn't know if I wanted to scream or laugh, probably both, but I didn't react, not out loud, not even with a text. Instead, I closed the app and tossed my phone face down on the counter. I spent the afternoon folding laundry, then refolding it just to keep my hands busy. Every few minutes, my mind would drift back to that photo, that caption, that comment. I wasn't excluded by accident. I was excluded on purpose. Late that evening, I gave in and opened the app again. This time, the top post on my feed was a collage Callista had just uploaded. The title? Family Highlights, Achievements We're Celebrating This Year. There were 9 squares. Dorian's new office, complete with an assistant and a new desk. Callista's promotion, framed certificate and all. Jared's nonprofit fundraiser. A cousin's wedding. Even a photo of Grant holding his old high school football trophy for no reason other than nostalgia. Nowhere was there a mention of me. Not the business I'd built, not the clients I'd landed, not the studio I'd finally found a location for after 6 months of searching. I wasn't part of the story, again. This time, it didn't sting the same way. It burned deeper, not because I was surprised, because I wasn't, but because I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. They didn't forget me. They erased me. And there's a difference. When someone forgets you, it's absent-minded. Clumsy. It hurts, sure, but it's forgivable. But when someone edits you out of their narrative, on purpose, with intention, that's not forgetfulness. That's control. I didn't text Callista. I didn't call Marla to ask why. I didn't send a sarcastic comment or passive-aggressive emoji. I didn't do anything. Instead, I walked into my home office, turned on the lamp, and stared at the whiteboard where I'd outlined next quarter's strategy. It was full: client goals, deadlines, marketing plans. But none of it mattered in that moment. And for the first time in a long time, I sat down and whispered to the quiet, "What if I don't owe them proof anymore?" I let the thought settle. What if the hustle, the drive, the silent need to make something they'd finally respect? What if all of that wasn't about fulfillment, but validation? And what if I didn't need it? I leaned back in my chair, looked around my space. No gold plaques, no Photoshop smiles, no captions trying to convince the world I mattered. Just my work, my space, my choices. And for the first time, it felt like enough. The next morning, I deleted the photo app off my phone, not out of spite, out of clarity. I didn't want to scroll anymore. I didn't want to measure my worth in likes or cropped images where I'd been conveniently cropped out. I didn't want their approval. I just wanted peace. By noon, I'd gone through my contact list and archived half the names. Anyone who'd only reached out through birthday likes or obligatory group texts disappeared from view. I cleaned out my inbox, unsubscribed from Grant's monthly updates and Callista's curated newsletters. Not a word from them. No, "Are you okay?" No, "We missed you." Not even a "Hope you're doing well." The silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. But they weren't the only ones who could play that game. I spent the rest of the week pouring myself into my business. I signed 2 new clients, wrapped up a workshop on streamlining creative systems, and drafted a pitch deck for a local arts council. My work had never felt so grounded. And so mine. And still they didn't call, not because they were busy, because they were watching, waiting. They wanted me to blink first, to send the olive branch, to act like I'd overreacted again. Like always. But I didn't. I wouldn't. Because something had shifted, something fundamental. It wasn't their silence that haunted me. It was how loud my absence had become. The week had been unusually quiet. Too quiet, not in the peaceful, meditative kind of way, but the heavy sort of quiet that makes you brace for something to crash through the stillness. I kept waiting for the next message, the next backhanded comment disguised as concern, but nothing came until that Thursday. It was late afternoon, and I had just wrapped up a virtual consultation with a new client, a small boutique brand out of Portland that wanted help streamlining their internal systems. We'd had a great session. My notes were tight, the client was energized, and I felt like, for once, I'd walked into something that made me feel seen, capable, and in control. I was in the middle of pouring myself a cup of tea when the intercom buzzed. The sound jolted me. No one buzzed unannounced. My friends knew to text first. The clients I saw in person booked ahead. Even the delivery drivers knocked and left. I froze for a second, staring at the intercom box like it had betrayed me. Then I pressed the button. "Yeah?" "It's Dad." The voice crackled through the speaker like an echo from a dream I'd sworn I'd stopped having. "I'm downstairs. Thought I'd drop something off." I didn't answer right away. I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard it. Wanted to slip back into my apartment and pretend the tea kettle was the only thing demanding my attention, but old instincts die hard. I buzzed him in. He knocked softly, a 3 count, like we were playing a game we used to know the rules to. When I opened the door, he was standing there with a paper bag from the grocery store, King Soopers. The logo faded, the corners crumpled. Inside, I could already see the corner of a plastic cookie box peeking out. He lifted the bag like an offering. "You used to love these," he said. I didn't respond right away. Just stepped aside and let him in, wordlessly. He moved past me like he still owned the air in my space. I closed the door. He looked around. "Nice place," he muttered, eyes scanning the living room like he was doing an appraisal. "You've made it cozy." I walked past him, set the tea mug down on the counter, and opened the cupboard. Tea? I asked. Sure, he said, surprised. I knew it wasn't hospitality. It was a signal. I wasn't letting him control the narrative. Not here. He sat on the edge of my couch like he wasn't sure if he was staying long or hoping I'd ask him to. I brought over 2 mugs, mine still warm, his freshly poured. I didn't say anything. I just handed it to him, sat down in the armchair across from him, and waited. He cleared his throat. I didn't want things to feel tense, he began. I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. You know your mother worries, and Callista, well, she's got a lot on her plate. Another pause. I figured I'd come by. Bring a little peace offering. He gestured to the bag on the counter like the cookies were supposed to fix a decade of being undermined. I gave him a thin smile. They still use red dye in those? He blinked. What? The cookies. You know that dye gives me migraines now. Oh, he said. I didn't realize. Of course he didn't. He sipped the tea. Burned his tongue, probably, but didn't flinch. He looked around again. This time, his gaze settled on my desk in the corner, my whiteboard covered in project notes, the pinned-up client logos and vision maps. He nodded slowly, then tilted his head. So, he said, who helped you pull all this together? I blinked. What do you mean? He gestured loosely. I mean, it looks professional, sharp. You must have had someone help. A designer or, I don't know, business coach? It was said with that tone, the one that sounds supportive if you're not paying attention, but carries a blade if you are. I didn't answer right away. Just took a slow sip of my tea and set the mug down carefully on the coaster. Then I smiled, lightly, the kind of smile you use when you finally stop needing to explain. No one helped me, I said. Just me. He looked away. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not a scream, not a slammed door or a teary declaration. Just silence, deliberate, grounded, unbothered. He wasn't used to that. He'd expected defense, a list of names, a validation of his assumption that someone, anyone, must have carried me here. Instead, he got the truth, and it sat in the air between us like smoke. He stood after a few more minutes of awkward small talk, asked about my rent, my neighbors, and made a joke about parking in the city. I nodded, answered politely, but nothing in my posture said, "Please stay." At the door, he paused. "You know," he said, "you always did take things a little too personally. It's just how we joke." I tilted my head. Then maybe I've outgrown the joke. His eyes narrowed, just slightly. But he didn't respond. He stepped out. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment. My apartment was still. The kettle was still warm on the stove. His mug sat half full on the table. The cookie box remained untouched on the counter. He left the cookies on the counter, and the insult unacknowledged in the air. I didn't touch the cookies. They stayed on the counter for 3 full days, untouched, unopened, like a dare or a trap. Every time I passed them on the way to the kitchen or my desk, I felt the weight of them staring back at me, not because I wanted them, but because I knew exactly what they symbolized, a cheap gesture meant to say, "See, I showed up," without ever addressing the harm that came before. On the 3rd morning, a different package showed up. It was waiting outside my door when I came back from checking the mail. Soft pink wrapping paper, tied with a satin ribbon that was too perfect, too pristine, like it had never been touched by real hands. No return address, just a little white card slipped under the ribbon loop. "Saw this and thought of you. Love, Mom." I didn't open it right away. I carried it inside like it might leak something I wasn't ready to feel. I placed it on the counter next to the cookies, where it sat like an intruder waiting to be acknowledged. But later that afternoon, when the light hit it just right and the house had gone still again, curiosity cracked the seal. Inside the box was a silky pink pajama set. Thin straps, soft sheen, delicate lace at the collar. And as soon as I pulled it out, I knew exactly what it was. The same color Marla had worn at the dinner. The exact shade of pink that she and Callista had quietly coordinated in, the feminine but polished uniform they always defaulted to when they wanted to send a message without saying a word. Back then, I hadn't thought much of it. Now, holding the pajamas in my hands, I saw it for what it was. This wasn't a gift. This was a signal, a smug, performative olive branch wrapped in silk. A whisper that said, "Here's how we see you." Or maybe more accurately, "Here's what you should be: soft, silent, delicate, ornamental." It hit me harder than the cookies, because the cookies were Grant's clumsy nostalgia. But this was Marla's precision, her way of pretending to care while simultaneously diminishing everything I'd built. I folded the pajamas once, then again. I placed them neatly back in the box, closed the lid, and pushed it away. That night, the phone rang. I let it buzz twice before I picked up, already knowing who it was. "Hey!" Dorian's voice came through, easy, practiced, like nothing was wrong. "You busy?" "I was just about to start something," I said flatly, not offering more. He didn't take the hint. "Listen, Mom's upset." I didn't respond. "I mean, she sent you something, right? She said she picked it out special." "She did," I said, "and it was very telling." He sighed like I was the difficult one, like I always had been. "Daisy, come on, it's not that deep. She's trying, okay? And you kind of escalated everything by walking out." I kept my voice even. "I didn't make the joke, Dorian. I just refused to laugh at it." "Yeah, but nothing," I interrupted. "You all laughed. Even she did. She was uncomfortable." "No, she was compliant. There's a difference." The line went quiet, then he softened his tone, like I was a child being unreasonable. "I just think, maybe if you reached out, said sorry." "For what?" "For walking out. For making it weird." I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictably absurd. "I didn't make it weird, Dorian. I stopped pretending it wasn't." He sighed again, longer this time. "Look, I know things aren't perfect, but you're being stubborn." "No," I said calmly. "I'm being clear." I hung up before he could say anything else. I sat there afterward, phone still in my hand, not angry, just drained. Tired of explaining why disrespect disguised as tradition still cut like glass. Tired of having to smooth it over so the others could stay comfortable in their curated dysfunction. That night, I placed the pajama box in a paper bag and tucked it into my closet. But it wasn't for safekeeping. The next morning, I added it to my donation pile. Not because I didn't appreciate the effort, because I saw through it, because I was done confusing pleasantries with peace. It was raining lightly when I dropped off the donation bag at the community shelter 2 blocks away. I didn't linger, didn't look back, just handed it over and walked back under a gray sky that felt more honest than any smile I'd been handed lately. Later that evening, I sat at my desk. The apartment was quiet again, but this time, it didn't press in, it gave space. I opened my laptop, stared at the glowing screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing in a folder name, Public Launch Prep. It was time, not for revenge, not to prove anything to them, but to draw a line between who I used to be and who I wasn't willing to become again. I opened my pitch deck, refined some slides, cleaned up the copy, rewrote my intro section so it sounded like me, not a diluted version. Then I scrolled to the final slide, the one with my name on it. Daisy Lang. Strategy. Brand direction. I looked at it for a long time, not because I was uncertain, but because I finally recognized it. This time, when I closed the lid of my laptop, I wasn't shutting down. I was gearing up. I closed the lid of my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and let the silence of my apartment press around me. Not heavy this time, but affirming. Like a room finally breathing again after years of holding its breath. I sat for a few minutes, staring at nothing in particular, just being still, until the phone rang. Not a message, not a notification, a full ring. It startled me a bit. I glanced at the screen. Yvette. Aunt Yvette. I hadn't heard from her in at least 6 months, maybe longer. She was my mother's older sister, always a bit of an outsider in the family tree, the one who'd moved to the Pacific Northwest decades ago and never really looked back. Some in the family said she'd gone weird. Others said she'd chosen a lonely life. But I remembered her differently. She was the first adult who ever taught me it was okay to say no. I picked up. "Hi," I said, unsure what else to offer. "Daisy." Her voice came through warm, full of something I hadn't heard in a while. Care without condition. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "No," I said softly. "Not at all." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking about you. Heard about the dinner." That sentence alone, without judgment or sugarcoating, felt like a warm cloth on a bruise. I didn't say anything. "I wasn't there, obviously," she continued. "But Marla sent me photos. You weren't in any of them. That told me enough." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I know what they did, Daisy. I've seen that kind of silence before. I lived it." That stopped me cold. "I'm sorry?" I asked. She laughed, not unkindly. "You think you're the first in our family to be erased? I left that house 30 years ago because I got tired of being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. I told the truth once at a holiday dinner, and they never let me forget it. The room around me changed. The walls didn't shift, but something inside me did. Recognition, not sympathy, relief. She knew. "You're not wrong for needing distance," she said. "You're not broken because you don't fit their mold. Their mold is cracked, has been for years." I swallowed the knot in my throat. It's like they don't even notice they're doing it. "Oh, honey, they notice. They just don't want to change. And when you stop playing your part, it makes them uncomfortable." I smiled, a bitter but grateful smile. "That sounds exactly right." We talked for almost an hour. About her garden. About a women's circle she'd started in her town. About the kinds of freedom that don't look glamorous but are everything. She never said, "You should go back." Never said, "Family is family." She just listened. Before we hung up, she said, "Your silence isn't weakness, it's your superpower." That line stayed with me long after the call ended. The next morning, I got up before the alarm. The light coming through my apartment windows felt less like a spotlight and more like an invitation. I brewed coffee, grabbed my notebook, and spread my pitch materials out across the kitchen island. It wasn't just a workday, it felt like declaration prep. I scheduled 2 new meetings, clients I'd been hesitant to reach out to, but not anymore. I designed a rough draft of a logo, nothing fancy, just my initials and a mark that felt solid. Grounded. Me. Then I ordered a sign for my new studio, white letters on a charcoal background. Clean. Clear. Daisy Lang. Strategy. Brand direction. No tagline. No daughter of or consultant for. Just me. Later that afternoon, Yvette sent a follow-up message. "Never forget, sweet girl. Quiet women can build empires. Just make sure your door doesn't swing both ways anymore. You don't owe re-entry to those who left you in the dark." I typed out 3 different responses, then finally just replied, "Thank you. Truly." By Thursday, I was back in the studio, still working through paint fumes and delivery delays, but it was coming together. Furniture arrived. The wall-mounted whiteboard went up. My new sign would be installed by the weekend. I was reviewing client files when the buzzer rang. I paused, confused. I hadn't scheduled anyone. I walked to the door monitor. It was Grant. Again. He stood there like he had the first time, arms crossed, expression unreadable, like he wasn't sure whether he was here to praise or punish. I could have ignored it, could have let him leave wondering. But something in me said, "No more ducking." I buzzed him in. When he arrived, I didn't offer tea. I didn't smile. I just opened the door, stepped aside, and let him in. He stepped into the studio slowly, eyes scanning everything. The clean walls, the large desk, the waiting area with 2 curated chairs and a small hospitality cart. It wasn't grand, but it was professional. He didn't comment. I didn't narrate. Instead, I led him through, like a gallery. No tour guide energy, no need to justify anything. He stopped at my office door, saw the framed draft of the new logo on the wall. He stared at it a beat too long. Then he muttered, "This isn't what I pictured for you." I didn't flinch. "That's the point," I said. Silence stretched, thick and full, not uncomfortable, but final. He looked at me like he wanted to say something else, maybe a defense, maybe a complaint, but he didn't. He turned and walked out. I didn't follow, didn't wait, didn't hope for a hug or a backward glance, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for him to look back as he walked away. By the time Grant left the studio without a word, the air in that space had changed. Not because he'd said something important, he hadn't, but because I hadn't needed him to. The silence had done all the speaking for me. I locked the door behind him, turned off the lights, and stood in the dark for a moment longer than necessary. The street lamps outside cast long shadows against the studio's freshly painted walls. The sign with my name was still leaning against the corner, waiting for installation. I touched it lightly on the edge, as if anchoring myself to the decision I'd made long before that visit. That weekend, the studio launch date was officially set. I chose it with a kind of precision that didn't require malice, just timing. Same weekend as Theo's engagement party, different location, different audience, different purpose. I didn't make a public announcement, no Instagram teasers, no save the dates posted in stories. I wasn't after attention. This wasn't a performance. It was a statement. My guest list was hand-curated. Former clients, mentors, local entrepreneurs I'd collaborated with. Creative directors from brands that had once dismissed my emails and now returned to ask for help. There was no mention of family, not because I was punishing them, but because this chapter didn't require their approval. On Friday night, I arrived at the studio 2 hours before the first guest. I lit a candle in the corner, not for scent, but for presence. The soft flicker against the wall felt like a quiet drumbeat in my chest. The branding materials were already up, minimalist, strong. Every element in the room said, "You're not here to be impressed. You're here to belong." The glass wall at the front caught the reflection of my own name, etched cleanly in white, Daisy Lang. Strategy, brand direction. I took one long breath, then opened the doors. Guests trickled in slowly, exactly as I'd hoped, not loud, not performative, just real conversations, laughter, curiosity. A woman I'd helped relaunch her jewelry line hugged me tightly. "You didn't just help me fix a brand," she said. "You helped me trust my voice again." Someone else complimented the mood boards on the back wall. "This feels intentional," she said. I smiled. "That's because it is." By the time the room filled up, I wasn't anxious. I was present. People didn't just ask about my work. They asked how I felt building it. They weren't interested in gossip or family drama. They were here because they'd seen what I created, and they respected it. And then came the moment I didn't expect. A former client, Malcolm, someone I'd consulted for during one of my earliest freelance gigs, raised a glass. He didn't make a big show, no clinking of forks, just a calm, steady voice that quieted the room. "When I was on the verge of shutting my company down," he began, "Daisy didn't give me false hope. She gave me a map, a real one. She didn't just say what to do, she listened. And then she showed me what I was missing." He paused, met my eyes. "This studio isn't about success," he said. "It's about survival, turned into strategy." The room fell into silence for a heartbeat. Then came applause. Warm. True. No one clapping out of obligation. I didn't cry. I just nodded, placed a hand over my chest, and whispered a quiet, "Thank you." Outside, night had fallen. The soft glow from inside reflected onto the sidewalk. People were still mingling, still talking, but the space felt full in the way I'd never experienced at family gatherings, without the masks, without the sharp elbows of competition. And then my phone buzzed. I checked it without urgency, just out of habit. A text from Callista. "Why didn't you tell us?" Simple, sharp, vaguely accusatory. As if the silence was the offense, not the years that led to it. An email came in right after, from Marla. Subject line: "This could have been a family moment." The body of the message was shorter than I expected. "You didn't even give us the chance to support you. That hurts more than you know. There was no mention of the years they hadn't asked, no reference to the dinner, or the joke, or the pink pajamas. Grant didn't write. I stared at the screen for a long minute. Then I locked the phone, slipped it into my pocket, and went back to the people who were still in the room. People who had shown up without needing to be asked. People who knew how to clap without needing a script. The silence I gave them wasn't cold. It wasn't bitter. It was intentional. A boundary. Not a barricade. A line that said, "I'm not here to be saved. I've already arrived." Of course, that silence wouldn't last. Not with what came next. It started with a headline. 3 days after my studio launch, I woke to a ping from a local news app I barely remembered downloading. The push notification read, "From side hustle to strategy, local consultant opens groundbreaking creative studio." It was me. The article included a photo from the launch, one I didn't pose for. I stood by the reception desk, speaking to a client. The angle wasn't flattering, but it was real. The piece quoted 2 attendees and mentioned the unique space I'd created for independent brands. It was light, respectful, celebratory, without fluff. Then, just a few scrolls down the page, another headline appeared. This one in the business section. Former city advisors past revisited amid daughter's rising profile. I paused. I tapped. And there he was, Grant Lang. A name I knew too well. A face I could sketch in sleep. But the article was not about him being a proud father. It detailed a business ethics investigation from 10 years ago. Nothing criminal, just shady. The kind of behavior people excuse when the person's charming enough or well-connected. Lapses in reporting, selective disclosure, and quiet favors exchanged for long-term contracts. Language that doesn't shout guilt, but also doesn't whisper innocence. The article didn't mention me, not directly, but the timing, 3 days after the studio launch, during a week where people were still talking about my opening, was no coincidence. Someone had leaked this. Maybe a former associate with a score to settle. Maybe someone who didn't like how neatly the family's image was being polished through proximity to me. And that's when it hit me. For the first time, his name was echoing in the community, not because of something he did, but because of who I was becoming. The irony was almost poetic. Later that afternoon, I received an email from a polished-looking leadership nonprofit, one I'd never interacted with before. Subject line, "Celebrating Legacy, a spotlight on father-daughter entrepreneurial stories." I didn't even need to read the full message to feel the pit in my stomach forming. But I read it anyway. They wanted to feature me and Grant in a series highlighting family business dynamics. They referenced my recent success and the legacy of civic leadership I apparently came from. I closed the laptop, then reopened it, and replied with one line, "No, I won't help rewrite a story I was never allowed to tell." I didn't hear back. But the silence had a different weight now. It didn't feel ominous. It felt like resistance had been noted. 2 hours later, Callista called. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. I answered on the 3rd ring. "What the hell did you do?" she snapped, no greeting. "Hi to you too," I said calmly. "Do you know what's happening? The articles, the questions, people are calling Dad non-stop." "I didn't leak anything, Callista." "But you benefited from it." I paused, then said clearly, "I didn't write the story. He did. I just stopped co-signing it." There was silence. Then she dropped the accusation. "You sabotaged him." I didn't raise my voice. "No. He built the house on sand. I'm just not holding up the frame anymore." She muttered something under her breath and hung up. 30 minutes later, a voicemail came through from Marla. Her voice was quieter than usual, less laced with polished steel, but still wrapped in guilt instead of accountability. "You've really hurt him," she said. "I don't know if you're proud of yourself, but I hope it was worth it." I didn't respond. I didn't even save the message. I just deleted it. Like a paperweight I no longer needed on my chest. That night, I stayed late at the studio. The lights were low. The hum of the street outside drifted through the windows. I watched as a mother walked past, holding her daughter's hand. The little girl had on bright yellow boots and a backpack too big for her frame. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw it, clear as anything. The girl tugged on her mom's sleeve, pointed up at the name etched on my window. My name. The mother leaned down and whispered something in the girl's ear. The child looked up at the studio again and nodded, her eyes wide. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was everything, because for the first time, I saw the ripple effect not in the family who tried to dim me, but in strangers who saw me without the filter of history. I had become visible without asking for permission, and slowly, the texts and emails from my family trickled to nothing. No more attempts to loop me in, no more invitations framed as obligations. Just space. It wasn't silence from anger this time. It was silence from understanding. They knew. I wasn't coming back. Not to their table. Not to their version of me. Not to the character they'd written and expected me to play forever. I stood by the window until the mother and daughter disappeared around the corner. And I smiled. Not because everything was healed, but because finally, no one else was holding the pen. But even after they stopped talking, they still wanted to be seen next to me. It came quietly, like most things from Marla did. No dramatic call, no voicemail laced with guilt or barbed affection. Just an email with a subject line that read, "A favor, if you're free." I hesitated before opening it. The message was brief, polite. Clipped in that practiced, polished way only my mother could manage, just enough emotional language to feel warm, but still stiff as a starched collar. Callista's daughter is getting married this spring, and we're arranging a professional portrait session to capture a complete family photo. Everyone will be there. It would mean a lot to have everyone included. Just smile and make it easier. There it was. Not an invitation, a prescription, and not for connection, but for optics. I read it twice, then leaned back in my chair at the studio. Sunlight poured through the window, lighting up the pale rug where we usually held client strategy circles. It was mid-morning, quiet enough that I could hear the gentle tick of the small wall clock above the reception shelf. The idea of that photo. All of us, lined up like the perfect family. Siblings arranged by age. Parents at the center. Me, placed at the edge, always the edge, told to tilt in, smile soft, say cheese. 1,000 pictures over the years, and yet somehow I was always the one blinking or blurred or left unnamed when they shared it online. And now they wanted me in the frame again, not for reconciliation, but for symmetry. I thought about the pink pajamas, the cookies, the soft launch that none of them attended, though they clearly followed it from the sidelines. I thought about how they'd never once asked what my business actually did, how Callista had said, "Don't come if you're going to make this about you." And yet, here they were, asking me to help complete the picture. I tapped out a reply and hovered for a moment, then typed a single line. Am I part of this family? Or just the frame? I hit send. The silence that followed wasn't unfamiliar. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like a decision hanging in the air, waiting to be made. The next message came not from Marla, but from Callista, short, sharp. If you're going to make this about you again, don't come. There was no pleas, no attempt at kindness, no pretense, just the confirmation I hadn't known I needed. So I didn't respond, and I didn't go, not to the photo shoot, not to the wedding planning brunch that followed, not to the group chat that lit up with color-coordinated outfit options and seating charts I was never mentioned in. Instead, I spent that Saturday morning at the studio, prepping for something else entirely, a youth mentorship event I'd been quietly building for months. A dozen local high school girls, most of them first-generation college-bound, were set to arrive just after 10. By 10:30, the room was buzzing. Laughter echoed off the walls. Hands scribbled notes, eyes lit up with new ideas. I led a session on strategic storytelling, how to pitch yourself not just as competent, but as essential. How to walk into rooms that weren't built for you and decide to stay anyway. During a break, one of the girls, maybe 16, hovered near the snack table. She held a bottle of water in one hand and her phone in the other. She glanced at me. "I told my mom I want to grow up to be like you," she said. The words caught me mid-step. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because I'd already done that kind of grieving. What came now wasn't sadness, it was something deeper. Recognition. Relief. I smiled. Then you'll probably grow up to be stronger. She grinned. She said the same thing. We went back to the group. Later that afternoon, after the last of them left and the studio had quieted again, I sat by the front window, sipping lukewarm tea. Outside, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I thought about the family photo being taken across town, the forced smiles, the careful posing, the inevitable cropping of reality, and I felt no ache, no longing, because this space, this work, this truth, was my portrait. Not posed, not curated, just mine. Not every story needs applause. Some just need to end in your own voice. It had been 3 weeks since the last message from anyone in my family. No blurry photos from Callista's wedding shoot, no out-of-context memes dropped into the once hyperactive family group chat. Not even one of those distant, just checking in texts from Marla that came with a timestamp of midnight and the emotional depth of an invoice. And for once, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like air. Clean, breathable, mine. That Thursday evening, I had just finished leading a mentorship session at the studio. The windows were fogged slightly from the warm breath of ideas and caffeine. The smell of paper, whiteboard markers, and orange blossom tea hung in the air, the scent of ambition in progress. A few of the mentees had lingered past the session, as they often did, chatting excitedly about a project idea that had accidentally turned into a pitch deck. Their laughter, unfiltered and earnest, had filled the space like music. They left behind half-drunk water bottles and the shimmering imprint of something real taking root. As I moved around the room, gathering notebooks, wiping off smudged dry erase ink, and refilling the tea tin by the window, my phone buzzed from its resting place on the bookshelf. One text. From an unfamiliar number. At first, I hesitated. Spam, probably. Another marketing campaign pretending to know me. But something, instinct maybe, urged me to tap it open. The message was short, unassuming. Auntie, I want to be like you. Mom says you're too serious. I think you're just real. I reread it. Then again, it was Callista's daughter, 16, maybe 17 now. The last time I saw her, she was draped in a tie-dye hoodie at a family barbecue 3 summers ago, the kind where everyone smiled too much and said too little. She had asked me once, tentatively, if I liked working alone. I'd answered with something that sounded wise at the time but didn't make full sense to me until recently. Some work is too important to dilute. Now, here she was, 3 years and several lifetimes later, finding me again. Her voice was still soft, but it had shape now. It carried edge, understanding, like she'd spent enough time watching people lie to recognize someone who didn't. I didn't reply. Not immediately. Instead, I walked over to the leather-bound journal I kept tucked into a drawer in the back corner of the studio. It hadn't seen fresh ink since the studio's opening day, when I'd scribbled something across the front page in shaky cursive, proof I was here. A phrase meant to remind me that even if no one clapped, I still mattered. I printed the text, trimmed the edges, taped it carefully to that page. Then I sat on the couch, the one with the fraying armrest I refused to replace, and let the studio dim around me. Outside, dusk folded gently into night. The wind moved through the trees like a soft conversation. It tapped lightly at the windows, as if checking in on me. I took a long, slow sip of my tea, and the quiet that followed wasn't hollow. It was full. Some things you hold on to, not because you expect more, but because they remind you that you're not invisible, that someone sees you, even when others refuse to. I glanced at the message one last time, then closed the journal with a deliberate quietness. She had seen me, and for now, that was enough. Days passed. The leaves outside the studio window began their seasonal slow dance from green to gold to rust. The trees looked like they were exhaling, giving in. I walked to work each morning in a light jacket and a pair of loafers worn just enough to mold to my stride. My coffee was always in hand, black, no sugar, as grounding as a mantra. Still, no word from Grant, no check-in from Marla. And something in me noticed that absence not with longing, but with clarity. I didn't miss them the way I once had. I didn't crave their validation. I didn't brace for their approval. I didn't write imaginary monologues in my head, prepping for conversations that would never come. I didn't flinch when I thought of their names. Some stories don't end in reunions, they end in realization. And with that realization, peace began to bloom. The door they once held closed, with conditions, critiques, and unspoken rules. I had stopped knocking on it. And once I stopped knocking, I saw it for what it was. A wall. So I built a new door. One where I could decide who walked through. One where I could choose myself. Again. And again. That afternoon, as I sat at my desk finalizing materials for the upcoming mentorship cycle, I created a new presentation slide. Session title, Building from Within. It was about foundations, about self-definition, about the bravery of ownership, especially when no one else hands it to you. It was about not needing to be seen to matter, about building rooms when no one opens the door, about being the architect of your own belonging. At the very end of the deck, I added a quiet slide. Just one sentence, black text on a white background. Legacy isn't what they say after you're gone. It's what you live out loud while you're still here. I leaned back in my chair. Let the words settle. Let the truth of them sit in my chest, not heavy, but firm. The studio was quiet around me. My name shimmered softly on the front glass window in brushed lettering. Daisy Lang. Not flashy, not oversized, but unmistakably mine. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling through the trees and fluttering the papers on my desk. I stood, crossed the room, and opened the window just a crack. A breeze slipped in. Steady, clear, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. It simply arrives and keeps moving. I closed my eyes for a moment, let it pass through. Then I smiled. Not the kind meant for photos, not the kind that waits for praise, but the kind that rises up from deep knowing. They had their dinner table, with all its performances, its scripts, and its unspoken rules. I have my name on the door. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not waiting for a seat. I'm walking in as the architect. And that's more than enough. Sometimes, walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom. When you stop waiting for people to see your worth, you make space to finally see it yourself. Have you ever been the outsider in your own family? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that speak quietly, but deeply.